This is what part is this? Part 3 of Eustace Mullins's The Secrets of the Federal Reserve read through. We're on chapter 4. But before we get into it, we're going to the disclaimer. This is for educational purposes only, and also for criticism, possibly comment for sure. News reporting, not really teaching. If the text teaches you something, scholarship, probably not, and research, at least kind of exploratory research for me. I mean, if anyone else gets anything out of it, that's great. So no medical, legal, or any other type of binding advice is provided on this video or my channel. So let's get that out of the way. We're on chapter 4, and it's entitled The Federal Advisory Council. In steamrolling the Federal Reserve Act through the House of Representatives, Congressman Carter Glass declared on September 30th, 1913, on the floor of the House that the interests of the public would be protected by an advisory council of bankers. Quote, there can be nothing sinister about its transactions. Meeting with it at least 4 times a year will be a bankers' advisory council representing every regional reserve district in the system. How can we have exercised greater caution in safeguarding the public interest? End quote. Carter Glass neither then nor later gave any substantiation for his belief that a group of bankers would protect the interests of the public, which they don't. They only protect themselves. Nor is there any evidence in the history of the United States that any group of bankers has ever done so. Exactly. So in fact, the Federal Advisory Council proved to be the quote administrative process, end quote, which Paul Warburg had inserted into the Federal Reserve Act to provide just the type of remote but unseen control over the system which he desired. When he was asked by financial reporter C.W. Barron, just after the Federal Reserve Act was enacted into law by Congress, whether he approved of the bill as it was finally passed, Warburg replied, quote, well, it hasn't got quite everything we want, but the lack will be adjusted later by administrative processes, end quote. The council proved to be the ideal vehicle for Warburg's purposes, as it has functioned for 70 years in almost complete anonymity, its members and their business associations unnoticed and unknown to the public. Senator Robert Owen, chairman of the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, had said, as quoted in the New York Times, August 3rd, 1913, before passage of the act, quote, the Federal Reserve Act will furnish the bank and industrial and commercial interests with the discount of qualified commercial paper, and thus stabilize our commercial and industrial life. The Federal Reserve banks are not intended as money-making banks, lols, but to serve a great national purpose of accommodating commerce and businessmen and banks, safeguard a fixed market for manufactured goods, for agricultural products, and for labor. There is no reason why the banks should be in control of the Federal Reserve System. Stability will make our commerce expand healthfully in every direction, end quote. Well, yeah, that didn't really happen, did it? But I would definitely need to do more research before really qualifying my own comment just there. That was an end quote. Senator Owen's optimism was doomed by the domination of Jekyll Island promoters, over the initial composition of the Federal Reserve System. Not only did the Morgan-Kuhn-Loeb alliance purchase the dominant control of stock of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, with almost half of the shares owned by the 5 New York banks under their control: First National Bank, National City Bank, National Bank of Commerce, Chase National Bank, and Hanover National Bank. But they also persuaded President Woodrow Wilson to appoint one of the Jekyll Island group, Paul Warburg, to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Each of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks was to elect a member of the Federal Advisory Council, which would meet with the Federal Reserve Board of Governors 4 times a year in Washington in order to advise, quote unquote, the board on future monetary policy. This seemed to assure absolute democracy, as each of the 12 advisors, quote unquote, representing a different region of the United States, would be expected to speak up for their economic interests of his area, and each of the 12 members would have an equal vote. The theory may have been admirable in its concept on paper, but as we know, that things on paper don't actually turn out to be what actually happens in actuality. But the hard facts of economic life resulted in a quite different picture. The president of a small bank in St. Louis or Cincinnati, sitting in conference with Paul Warburg and J.P. Morgan to advise, quote unquote, them on monetary policy, would be unlikely to contradict 2 of the most powerful international financiers in the world, as a scribbled note from either of them would be sufficient to plunge his little bank into bankruptcy. In fact, the small banks of the 12 Federal Reserve districts existed only as satellites of the big New York financial interests, and were completely at their mercy. Completely at their mercy. Martin Mayer, in The Bankers, pointed out that, quote, J.P. Morgan maintained correspondent relationships with many small banks all over the country, end quote. The big New York banks did not confine themselves to multi-million-dollar deals with other great financial interests, but carried on many smaller and more routine dealings with their correspondent, quote unquote, banks across the United States. Apparently secure in their belief that their activities would never be exposed to the public, the Morgan-Kuhn-Loeb interests boldly selected the members of the Federal Advisory Council from their correspondent banks and from banks in which they owned stock. Not surprising at all. No one in the financial community seemed to notice, as nothing was said about it during 70 years of the Federal Reserve System's operation. To avoid any suspicion that New York interests might control the Federal Advisory Council, its first president, elected in 1914 by other members, was J.B. Forgan, president of the First National Bank of Chicago. Rand Rand McNally Bankers Directory for 1914 lists the principal correspondents of the large banks. The principal correspondent bank of the Baker-Morgan controlled First National Bank of New York is listed as the First National Bank of Chicago. The principal correspondent listed for the First National Bank of Chicago is the Bank of Manhattan in New York, controlled by Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company. James B. Forgan, Forgan, James Forgan also was listed as a director of Equitable Life Insurance Company, also controlled by Morgan. However, the relationship between First National Bank of Chicago and these New York banks was even more closer than these listings indicate. On page 701 of The Growth of Chicago Banks by F. Cyril James, we find mention of, quote, the First National Bank of Chicago's profitable connection with the Morgan interests. A goodwill ambassador has hastily sent to New York to invite George F. Baker to become a director of the First National Bank of Chicago, end quote. J.P. Forgan to Ream, January 7th, 1903. In effect, Baker and Morgan had personally chosen the first president of the Federal Advisory Council. James B. Forgan, 1852 to 1924, also shows the obligatory, quote, London connection, end quote, in the operation of the Federal Reserve System. Born in St. Andrews, Scotland, he began his banking career there with the Royal Bank of Scotland, a correspondent of the Bank of England. He came to Canada for the Bank of British North America, worked for the Bank of Nova Scotia, which sent him to Chicago in the 1880s, and by 1900 he became president of the First National Bank of Chicago. He served for 6 years as president of the Federal Advisory Council, and when he left the council, he was replaced by Frank O. Wetmore, 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 who had also replaced him as president of the First National Bank of Chicago when Forgan was named chairman of the board. Representing the New York Federal Reserve District on the first Federal Advisory Council was J.P. Morgan. He was named chairman of the executive committee. Thus, Paul Warburg and J.P. Morgan sat in conference at the meetings of the Federal Reserve Board during the first 4 years of its operation, surrounded by the other governors and members of the council, who could hardly have been unaware that their futures would be guided by these two powerful bankers. Another member of the Federal Advisory Council in 1914 was Levi L. Rue, R-U-E, representing the Philadelphia District. Rue was president of the Philadelphia National Bank. Rand McNally Bankers Directory of 1914 listed as principal correspondent of the First National Bank of New York, the Philadelphia National Bank. First National Bank of Chicago also listed Philadelphia National Bank as its principal correspondent in Philadelphia. The other members of the Federal Advisory Council included Daniel S. Wing, president of the First National Bank of Boston; W.S. Rowe, R-O-W-E, president of the First National Bank of Cincinnati; and C.T. Jaffray, J-A-F-F-R-A-Y, Jaffray, President of the First National Bank of Minneapolis. Man, they really need to work on their freaking names. These are boring as hell. First National this, First National that, blah, blah, blah. Like, come on. If you're going to be villains, at least be a little more creative. Sheesh. These were all correspondent banks of the New York Big Five, quote unquote, banks who controlled the money market in the United States. Jaffray had an even closer connection with the Baker-Morgan interests. In 1908, to reinvest the large annual dividends from their First National Bank of New York stock, Baker and Morgan set up a holding company, First Security Corporation, which bought 500 shares from the First National Bank of Minneapolis. Thus, Jaffray was little more than a wage-earning employee of Baker and Morgan, although he had been selected, quote unquote, by stockholders of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis to represent their interests. First Security Corporation also owned 50,000 shares of Chase National Bank, 5,400 shares of National Bank of Commerce, 2,500 shares of Bankers Trust, 928 shares of Liberty National Bank, the bank of which Henry P. Davison had been president when he was tapped to join the J.P. Morgan firm, and shares of New York Trust, Atlantic Trust, and Brooklyn Trust. First Security concentrated on bank stocks, which rapidly appreciated in value and paid handsome annual dividends. I'm sure it did, or they did. In 1927, it earned $5 million, but paid the shareholders $8 million, taking the rest from its surplus. Sheesh. Another member of the initial Advisory Council, Federal Advisory Council. Man, I'm like extra dyslexic today or something. Pause, got a cough. Anyways, another member of the initial Federal Advisory Council was E.F. Swinney, or Swiney, Swinney. We'll just call him Swinney. President of the First National Bank of Kansas City. That's the other thing, like, it makes it more difficult to keep track of who's who. First National this, First National that. It's like, maybe it's on purpose. That way people get all confused and don't know, heads or tails of this shit. So Swinney is the president of the First National Bank of Kansas City. He was also a director of Southern Railway, and lists himself in Who's Who as, quote, independent in politics, end quote. Yeah, real independent, I'm sure. Archibald Keynes represented the San Francisco district of the Federal Advisory Council, although he maintained his office in New York as president of the American Foreign Banking Corporation. After serving as a governor of the Federal Reserve Board from 1914 to 1918, Paul Warburg did not request another term. However, he was not ready to sever his connection from the Federal Reserve System, which he had done so much to set up and put into operation. J.P. Morgan obligingly gave up his seat on the Federal Advisory Council, and for the next 10 years, Paul Warburg continued to represent the Federal Reserve District of New York on the council. He was vice president of the council 1922 to 1925 and president 1926 to 1927. Thus, Warburg remained the dominant presence at Federal Reserve Board meetings during the 1920s, when the European central banks were planning the Great Contraction of Credit, which precipitated the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. So it was all planned. Although most of the Federal Advisory Council's advice, quote unquote, to the Board of Governors has never been reported, on rare instances a few glimpses into its deliberations were afforded by brief items in the New York Times. On November 21st, 1916, the Times reported that the Federal Advisory Council had met in Washington for its quarterly conference. Quote, there was talk about absorbing Europe's extension of credit to South America and other countries. Federal Reserve officials said that to maintain a position as one of the world's bankers of the United States must expect to be called upon to render a good deal of the service performed largely by England in the past in extending short-term credits necessary in the production and transportation of goods of all kinds in the world's trade, and that acceptances in foreign trade require lowest discounts and the freest and most reliable gold markets. End quote. The First World War was at its zenith in 1916. That's a parenthesis after the quote. In addition to his service on the Board of Governors and the Federal Advisory Council, Paul Warburg continued to address bankers as groups about the monetary policies they were expected to follow. On October 22nd, 1915, he addressed the Twin City Bankers Club, St. Paul, Minnesota, during which speech he stated, quote, it is to your interest, pause. Where was I after I was interrupted by a phone call? I think I was about to quote somebody here. On October 22nd, 1915, Warburg, addressed the Twin City Bankers Club, St. Paul, Minnesota, during which speech he stated, quote, it is your interest to see the Federal Reserve Bank strong as they can possibly be. It staggers the imagination to think that what the future may have in store for the development of American banking. With Europe's foremost powers limited to their own field, with the United States turned into a creditor nation for all the world. The boundaries of the field that lies open for us are determined only by our power of safe expansion. The scope of our banking future will ultimately be limited by the amount of gold that we can muster as the foundation of our banking and credit structure. End quote. The composition of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Federal Reserve Advisory Council from its initial membership to the present day shows links to the Jekyll Island Conference and the London banking community, which offers incontrovertible evidence acceptable in any law court that there was a plan to gain control of the money and credit of the people of the United States and to use it for the profit of the architects. Old Jekyll Island hands were Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank, which bought a large portion of the shares of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914. Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company, Henry P. Davison, J.P. Morgan's right-hand man, and director of the First National Bank of New York and the National Bank of Commerce, which took a large portion of Federal Reserve Bank of New York stock, and Benjamin Strong, also known as a Morgan lieutenant, who served as governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York during the 1920s. Footnote. It's kind of a long footnote. Does it go on the next page? No. The footnote says, quote, the Federal Advisory Council has great influence with the Federal Reserve Board. Conspicuously upon that council is J.P. Morgan, the leading member of J.P. Morgan Company and son of the late J.P. Morgan. Every one of the 12 members of the Advisory Council, as you will know, was educated in the same atmosphere. The Federal Reserve Act is not only a special privileged act, but privileged persons have been placed in control and are its advisors in its administration. The Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Advisory Council administer the Federal Reserve System as its head authority, and no one of the lesser officials, even if they wished, would dare to cross swords with them, end quote. Parentheses from, quote, Why is Your Country at War, end quote, by Charles Lindbergh, published 1917, end of parentheses. The above paragraph explains why Woodrow Wilson ordered government agents to seize and destroy the printing plates and copies of this book in the spring of 1918. While it was still hot, I would imagine, destroyed what Charles Lindbergh was writing there, I suppose is what Mullins is referring to. Because this book wasn't published until 1952, so he wasn't writing it back in 1918. I don't think he was even born then. If I don't think he gave his birth date earlier in the foreword or anything. No. Anyways, back end of footnote. The selection of the regional members of the advisory council from the list of bankers who worked most closely with the Big Five, quote unquote, banks of New York, and who were their principal correspondent banks proves that the much touted, quote, regional safeguarding of the public interest, quote unquote, by Carter Glass and other Washington proponents of the Federal Reserve Act was from its very inception a deliberate deception. Derp derp, you know, all these bills, especially to give them names that literally are, well, not literally, but basically the opposite of what they do. You know, I don't need to really name names. I'm sure you can use your imagination to figure out which ones or any of them that you would want to bring up in more recent times. 2003, etc. Anyways, where was I? Yeah, deliberate deception. The fact that for 70 years, this council was able to meet with the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and to advise, quote unquote, the governors on decisions of monetary policy which affected the daily lives of every person in the United States without the public aware of their existence demonstrates that the planners of the central bank operation knew exactly how to achieve their objectives through, quote, administrative processes, and quote unquote, of which the public would remain ignorant. The claim that the advice, quote unquote, of the council members is not binding in the governors or on the governors or that it carries no weight is to claim that 4 years 4 times a year, 12 of the most influential bankers in the United States take the time from their work to travel to Washington to meet with the Federal Reserve Board merely to drink coffee and exchange pleasantries. Lols. It is a claim which anyone familiar with the workings of the business community will find impossible to take seriously. In 1914, it was a 4-day trip each way for bankers from the far west to come to Washington for a council meeting with the Federal Reserve Board. These men had extensive business interests which demanded their time. J.P. Morgan was the director of 63 corporations, which held annual meetings and, turn the page, could hardly expected to travel to Washington to attend meetings of the Federal Reserve Board if his advice was to be considered of no importance. Another footnote. The J.P. Morgan connection has remained predominant on the Federal Advisory Council. For the past several years, the prestigious Federal Reserve District Number 2, the New York District, has been represented on the Federal Advisory Council by Lewis Preston. Preston is chairman of J.P. Morgan Company and also chairman and chief executive officer of Morgan Guaranty Trust, New York. An heir to the Baldwin fortune, a company controlled by Morgan, Preston married the heiress of the Pulitzer newspaper fortune. On February 26, 1929, the New York Times noted that a merger had been effected between National Bank of Commerce and Guaranty Trust, making them the largest bank in the United States, with a capital of $2 billion. And that's back in 1929, just before the market crash. The merger was negotiated by Myron C. Taylor, president of U.S. Steel, a Morgan firm. The banks occupied adjoining buildings on Wall Street, and as the New York Times noted, quote, the Guaranty Trust Company long has been known as one of the, quote, Morgan Group, end quote, of banks, end quote. The National Bank of Commerce has also been identified with Morgan interests. End of footnote. And that's the end of chapter 4. Now we get into chapter 5. The House of Rothschild, or Rothschild, perhaps. Rothschild is the usual pronunciation, so I don't know if that's the correct one, but whatever. Chapter 5, The House of Rothschild. The success of the Federal Reserve conspiracy, and it is a conspiracy. There's no way you can't say it isn't a conspiracy, because it was, 9 men on Jekyll Island hatching their scheme, their conspiracy. The success of the Federal Reserve's conspiracy will raise many questions in the minds of readers who are unfamiliar with the history of the United States in finance capital, rather. How could the Kuhn-Loeb-Morgan alliance, powerful though it may be, believe that it would be capable first of devising a plan which would bring the entire money and credit of the people of the United States into their hands, and second, of getting such a plan enacted into law? The capability of devising and enacting the, quote, National Reserve Plan, end quote, was, as the immediate result of the Jekyll Island expedition was easily within the powers of the Kuhn-Loeb-Morgan alliance, according to the following from McClure's magazine, August 1911. Quote, The Seven Men, end quote, by John Moody. Quote, Seven men in Wall Street now control a great share of the fundamental industry and resources of the United States. Three of the seven men, J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and George F. Baker, head of the National Bank of New York, belong to the so-called Morgan Group. Four of them, John D. and William Rockefeller, James Stillman, head of the National City Bank, and Jacob H. Schiff of the private banking firm of Kuhn Loeb Company, to the so-called Standard Oil City Bank Group. The central machine of capital extends its control over the United States. The process is not only economically logical, it is now practically automatic. End quote. Thus we see that the 1910 plot to seize control of the money and credit of the people of the United States was planned by men who were already controlled by most of the country's resources. It seemed to John Moody, quote, practically automatic, end quote, that they should continue with their operations. What John Moody did not know or did not tell his readers was that the most powerful men in the United States were themselves answerable to another power, a foreign power, and a power which had been steadfastly seeking to extend its control over the young republic of the United States since its very inception. This power was the financial power of England, centered in the London branch of the House of Rothschild. The fact was that in 1910, the United States was for all practical purposes being ruled from England, and so it is today, allegedly, although I'm sure it's shuffled around a bit since this edition of the book, which I believe is 1991. I mean, that's what it says in the front of the book, is copyright is 1991. So, the 10 largest bank holding companies in the United States are firmly in the hands of certain banking houses, all of which have branches in London. They are J.P. Morgan Company, Brown Brothers Harriman, Warburg, Kuhn Loeb, and J. Henry Schroeder. All of them maintain close relationships with the House of Rothschild, principally through the Rothschild control of international money markets through its manipulation of the price of gold. Each day, the world price of gold is set in the London office of N.M. Rothschild and Company. I think that's Nathaniel Mayer Rothschild, or I forget which one it is. N.M. Rothschild. Although these firms are ostensibly American firms which merely maintain branches in London, the fact is that these banking houses actually take their direction from London. Their history is a fascinating one and unknown to the American public, originating as it did in the international traffic of gold, slaves, diamonds, and other contraband. There are no moral considerations in any business decision made by these firms. They are interested solely in money and power. Mullins is making it quite clear, in no uncertain terms here. Tourists today gape at the magnificent mansions of the very rich in Newport, Rhode Island, without realizing that not only do these cottages, quote unquote, stand as a memorial to the baronial baron, the barons, Baronial, baronial, baronial desires of our Victorian millionaires, but that their erection of these cottages, that is, in Newport represented a nostalgic memorialization of the great American fortunes, which had their beginnings in Newport when it was the capital of the slave trade. The slave trade for centuries had its headquarters in Venice until 17th century Britain, the new master of the seas, used its control of the oceans to gain a monopoly. As the American colonies were settled, its fiercely independent people, most of whom did not want slaves, most of whom did not want slaves, found that to their surprise that slaves were being sent to our ports in great numbers. Has anything really changed? I keep reading about history, and it's like if history doesn't rhyme, if it doesn't repeat, then it certainly freaking rhymes. Like good night. What it's like? Is that like a type of morphic resonance that like echoes out through time? Perhaps maybe if it's not like an immediate morphic resonance, then it's almost like like if you drop a pebble into a pond or whatever, and you see the ripples expand out over the pond. I don't know what I don't know. Just rambling here, I guess. Anyways, the slaves were found to be sent to our ports in great numbers. For many years, Newport was the capital of this unsavory trade. William Ellery, Ellery, the collector of the port of Newport, said in 1791, quote, an Ethiopian old as soon, this is like either a typo or, hold on, an Ethiopian old as soon change his skin, an Ethiopian old person, I guess, as soon change his skin as a Newport merchant old, or is that CLD? That's a CLD. I guess that's like shorthand for something. An Ethiopian CLD as soon change his skin as a Newport merchant CLD be induced to change so lucrative a trade for the slow profits of any manufactory. End quote. John Quincy Adams remarked in his diary, page 459, quote, Newport's former prosperity was chiefly owing to its extensive employment in the African slave trade, end quote. The preeminence of J.P. Morgan and the Brown firm in American finance can be dated to the development of Baltimore as the 19th century capital of the slave trade. Both of these firms originated in Baltimore, opened branches in London, came under the aegis of the House of Rothschild, and returned to the United States to open branches in New York and to become the dominant power not only in finance but also in government. In recent years, key posts such as the Secretary of Defense have been held by Robert Lovett, Lovett, partner of Brown Brothers Harriman, and Thomas S. Gates, partner of Drexel and Company, a J.P. Morgan subsidiary firm. The present Vice President, George Bush, is the son of Prescott Bush. a partner of Brown Brothers Harriman. For many years, the senator from Connecticut and the financial organizer of Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, of which he also was a director for many years. To understand why these firms operate as they do, it is necessary to give a brief history of their origins. Few Americans know that J.P. Morgan Company began as George Peabody and Company. Did not know that. George Peabody, 1795 to 1869, born at South Danvers, Massachusetts, began business in Georgetown, D.C. in 1814 as Peabody, Riggs and Company, dealing in the wholesale dry goods, and in operating the Georgetown slave market. In 1815, to be closer to their source of supply, they moved to Baltimore, where they operated as Peabody and Riggs from 1815 to 1835. Peabody found himself increasingly involved with business originating from London. And in 1835, he established the firm of George Peabody and Company in London. He had excellent entree, E-N-T-R-E-E. He had excellent entree in London business through another Baltimore firm established in Liverpool, the Brown Brothers. Alexander Brown came to Baltimore in 1801 and established what is now known as the oldest banking house in the United States, still operating as Brown Brothers Harriman of New York. Brown, Shipley and Company of England, and Alex Brown and Son of Baltimore. So we got several different iterations. Looks like several different companies even. Behind the scenes power wielded by this firm is indicated by the fact that Sir Montague Norman, Governor of the Bank of England for many years, was a partner of Brown, Shipley and Company. Within a footnote here. Footnote says, quote, there is an informal understanding that a director of Brown Shipley should be on the board of the Bank of England, and Norman was elected to it in 1907. End quote. Montague Norman, current biography, 1940. End of footnote. Considered the single most influential banker in the world, Sir Montague Norman was organizer of informal talks, quote unquote, between heads of central banks in 1927, which led directly to the great stock market crash of 1929. Soon after he arrived in London, George Peabody was surprised to be summoned to an audience with the gruff Baron Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Okay, I did get it right. Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Without mincing words, Rothschild revealed to Peabody that much of the London aristocracy openly disliked Rothschild and refused his invitations. He proposed that Peabody, a man of modest means, be established as a lavish host whose entertainers would soon be the talk of London. Rothschild would, of course, pay all the bills. Peabody accepted the offer and soon became known as the most popular host in London. His annual 4th of July dinner celebrating American independence became extremely popular with the English aristocracy, many of whom, while drinking Peabody's wine, regaled with each other with jokes about Rothschild's crudities and bad manners, without realizing that every drop they drank had been paid by Rothschild. Very interesting. It is It is hardly surprising that the most popular host in London would also become a very successful businessman, particularly with the House of Rothschild supporting him behind the scenes. Peabody often operated with a capital of £500,000 on hand, and became very astute in his buying and selling of both sides of the Atlantic. His American agent was the Boston firm of Beebe, Morgan and Company, Beebe, headed by Junius S. Morgan, father of John Pierpont Morgan. So J.P. Morgan, Junius S. Morgan is his father. Peabody, who never married, had no one to succeed him, and he was very favorably impressed by the tall, handsome Junius Morgan. He persuaded Morgan to join him in London as a partner of George Peabody and Company in 1854. In 1860, John Pierpont, uh, there's a typo here. I think it's Pierpont, but there's an I added in this time. I think it's Pierpont, not Pierpoint. That's just a typo. John Pierpont Morgan had been taken on as an apprentice by the firm of Duncan Sherman uh, in New York. He was not very attentive to business, and in 1864, Morgan's father was outraged when Duncan, Sherman, so it's two different business partners, I think. The name of the company, Duncan Sherman, refused to make his son a partner. He promptly extended an arrangement whereby one of the chief employees of Duncan Sherman, Charles H. Dabney, Dabney, was persuaded to join John Pierpont Morgan in a new firm, Dabney, Morgan and Company. Bankers Magazine, December 1864, noted that Peabody had withdrawn his account from Duncan Sherman and that other firms were expected to do so. The Peabody account, of course, went to Dabney Morgan Company. Morgan and Company. John Pierpont. Now I'm saying it. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 during the first money panic in the United States. Significant. And my headset turned off again. Anyways, where was I? Significantly, it had been caused by the House of Rothschild, with whom Morgan was later to become associated. In 1836, President Andrew Jackson, infuriated by the tactics of the bankers who were attempting to persuade him to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, said, quote, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. If people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before the morning." End quote. And that's one of the most famous quotes from President Jackson. If only that were true. If only that were true these days. Nothing ain't happening today. I don't know. Could you have a revolution without the whole system collapsing? I really doubt it. It's this parasitic system is so ingrained into the host that practically killing it would be killing the host at this point. And this is only really 100 years later as far as the Federal Reserve Act is concerned. And that was only part of it. That's like the next level. And now we're into even further levels of encroachment, to the point where it's like, where does the parasite end or the host end and the parasite begin at this point. I don't know. The whole thing has been corrupted. But I do like that quote. I'm going to say it again. Quote, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning." End quote. Although Nicholas Biddle was president of the Bank of the United States, it was well known that Baron James de Rothschild of Paris was the principal investor in this bank. Although Jackson um, had vetoed the renewal of the charter of the Bank of the United States, he probably was unaware that a few months earlier, in 1835, that the House of Rothschild had cemented a relationship with the United States government by superseding the firm of Baring, B capital Baring, as financial agent of the Department of State as on January 1st, 1835. Henry Clews, Clews, the famous banker, in his book 28 Years in Wall Street, states that the Panic of 1837 was engineered because the charter of the Second Bank of the United States had run out in 1836. Not only did President Jackson promptly withdraw government funds from the Second Bank of the United States, but he deposited these funds, $10 million, in state banks. The immediate result, Clews tells us, is the country began to enjoy great prosperity. This sudden flow of cash caused an immediate expansion of the national economy, and the government paid excuse me, and the government paid off the entire national debt, leaving a surplus of 50 million in the treasury. Well, how about that? Well, how about that? When you do something right, maybe things actually go right. The European financiers had the answer to the situation. Oh, we can't have them prospering. Can't have them flourishing. Oh, no, 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 no. We can't have this. The European financiers had the answer to the situation. Clews further states, quote, "The Panic of 1837 was aggravated by the Bank of England when it sent one when it in one day threw out all the paper connected with the United States." End quote. The Bank of England, of course, was synonymous with the name of Baron Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Why did the Bank of England in one day throw out, quote unquote, all paper connected with the United States, that is, refuse to accept or discount any securities, bonds, or other financial paper based in the United States? The purpose of this action was to create an immediate financial panic in the United States, cause a complete contraction of credit, halt further issues of stocks and bonds, and ruin those seeking to turn United States securities into cash. In this atmosphere of financial panic, John Pierpont Morgan came into the world. His grandfather, Joseph Morgan, as well as uh, was a well-to-do farmer who owned 106 acres in Hartford, Connecticut. He later opened the City Hotel and the Exchange Coffee Shop, and in 1819 was one of the founders of Aetna Insurance Company, Aetna, Aetna, George Peabody found that he had chosen well in selecting Junius S. Morgan as his successor. Morgan agreed to continue the sub rosa relationship with Nathan Mayer Rothschild Company. Sub rosa, well, there's a clue there. And soon expanded the firm's activities by shipping large quantities of railroad iron to the United States. It was Peabody Iron which was the foundation for much of American railroad tracks from 1860 to 1890. In 1864, content to retire and leave his firm in the hands of Morgan, Peabody allowed the name to be changed to Junius S. Morgan Company. The Morgan firm, this is around this time of the Second World War, 1861 to 1865 did I say the Second World War? I meant the Civil War, excuse me. Sheesh. I meant to say Civil War was around this time, 1861 to 1865, I believe. So it's not like this is in the middle of nothing happening. There's a lot happening during this time. You had the panic back in 1837, and then the Civil War happened in 1861, and you have Peabody retiring and Morgan taking over his vast fortune, I guess, for lack of a better term, changing the name to Junius S. Morgan Company. The Morgan firm then and since has been directed from London. John Pierpont Morgan spent much of his time at his magnificent London mansion, Prince's Gate. One of the high water marks of the successful Rothschild-Peabody-Morgan business venture was the Panic of 1857. So another manufactured crisis 20 years later. It had been 20 years since the Panic of 1837. Excuse me. Its lessons had been forgotten by hordes of eager investors who were anxious to invest the profits of a developing America. Excuse me. This is also a time of the Industrial Revolution as well. Where was I? Profits developing America, developing with the Industrial Revolution, I'm sure. It was time to fleece them again. The stock market operates like a wave washing up on the beach. It sweeps with it many minuscule creatures who derive all of their life support from the oxygen and water of the wave. They coast along at the crest of the quote tide of prosperity end quote. Suddenly the wave, having reached the high water mark on the beach, recedes, leaving all of the creatures gasping on the sand. Another wave may come in time to save them, but in all likelihood it will not come as far, and some of the sea creatures are doomed. In the same manner, waves of prosperity fed by newly created money through an artificial contraction of credit recedes, leaving those it had borne high to gasp, and die without hope of salvation. Corsair, The Life of J.P. Morgan, tells us that the Panic of 1857 was caused by the collapse of the grain market and by the sudden collapse of Ohio Life and Trust for a loss of $5 million. With this collapse, 900 other American companies failed. 900. Significantly, one not only survived, but prospered from the cash. In Corsair, we learned that the Bank of England lent George Peabody and Company £5 million during the Panic of 1857. Winkler in Morgan the Magnificent, sheesh, what a title, says that the Bank of England advanced Peabody £1 million, an enormous sum at that time, and the equivalent of $100 million today, to save the firm. So another 30 years, that's going to be what, like 300 million? Or maybe more, maybe less. I don't know. I'm just guessing. In 1991 terms versus 2026. Anyways, however, no other firm received such beneficence during this panic. The reason is revealed by Matthew Josephson in The Robber Barons. He says on page 60, quote, "For such qualities of conservatism and purity, George Peabody and Company, the old tree out of which the house of Morgan grew, was famous. In the panic of 1857, when depreciated securities had been thrown on the market by distressed investors in America, Peabody and the elder Morgan, being in possession of cash, had purchased such bonds as possessed real value freely, and then resold them at a large advance when sanity was restored." End quote. Another fleece. Thus, from a number of biographies of Morgan, the story can be pieced together. After the panic had been engineered, one firm came into the market with £1 million in cash, purchased securities from distressed investors at panic prices, and later resold them at an enormous profit. That firm was the Morgan firm, and behind it was the clever maneuvering of Baron Nathan Mayer Rothschild. The association remained secret from the most knowledgeable financial minds in London and New York, although Morgan occasionally appeared as the financial agent in a Rothschild operation. As the Morgan firm grew rapidly during the late 19th century until it dominated the finances of the nation, many observers were puzzled that the Rothschilds seemed so little interested in profiting by investing in the rapidly advancing American economy. John Moody notes in The Masters of Capital, page 27, quote, "The Rothschilds were content to remain a close ally of Morgan, as far as the American field was concerned." End quote. Secrecy was more profitable than valor. Yeah, I imagine. The reason that the European Rothschilds preferred to operate anonymously in the United States behind the facade of J.P. Morgan and Company is explained by George Wheeler in Pierpont Morgan and Friends, The Anatomy of a Myth, page 17, quote, "But there were steps being taken even now to bring him out of the financial backwaters, and they were not being taken by Pierpont Morgan himself. The first suggestion of his name for a role in the recharging of the reserve originated with the London branch of the House of Rothschild, Belmont's employers." End quote. Wheeler goes on to explain that a considerable anti-Rothschild movement had developed in Europe and the United States, which focused on the banking activities of the Rothschild family. Even though they had a registered agent in the United States, August Schonberg, Schoenberg, who had changed his name to Belmont when he came to the United States as the representative of the Rothschilds in 1837. it was extremely advantageous to them to have an American representative who was not known as a Rothschild agent. Although the London house of Junius S. Morgan and Company continued to be the dominant branch of the Morgan enterprises, with the death of the senior Morgan in 1890 in a carriage accident on the Riviera, John Pierpont Morgan became the head of the firm. Carriage accident, that's kind of weird. Anyways, after operating as the American representative of the London firm from 1864 to 1871 as Dabney Morgan Company, Morgan took on a new partner in 1871, Anthony Drexel of Philadelphia. That might be the person that Drexel University is named after. I'm not sure. Anyways, Anthony Drexel of Philadelphia and operated as Drexel Morgan and Company until 1895. Drexel died in that year, and Morgan changed the name of the American branch to J.P. Morgan and Company. LaRoche tells us that February 5th, 1891, a secret association known as the Round Table Group was formed in London by Cecil Rhodes. Here we go. This banker, Lord Rothschild, the Rothschild-in-law, Lord Rosebery, Rosebery. Let's go with Rosebery. And Lord Curzon. He states that in the United States, the Round Table was represented by the Morgan Group. Dr. Carroll Quigley refers to this group as, quote, the British American Secret Society, end quote, in tragedy and hope. Man, I have that right here on my desk, and it's massive. It's got to be, I think it's what? It's under a bunch of books. I don't want to mess with it. I think it's like 1,300 pages. I have it in hardback. I don't know if I'm gonna be reading that anytime soon, but it's thicker than most textbooks. Tragedy and Hope. It's a monster. Whether I agree with everything in it is a whole another story. I mean, Quigley's got his viewpoint. Wasn't he Clinton's mentor or something? I forget. He's Bill Clinton. I think he's tied to Clinton in some way. If memory strikes me. Maybe I'm wrong. Don't quote me on it. Anyways, Dr. Carroll Quigley refers to this group, the Round Table Group, as, quote, the British-American Secret Society, end quote, in tragedy and hope, stating that, quote, the chief backbone of this organization grew up along the already existing financial cooperation running from the Morgan Bank in New York to a group of international financiers in London led by Lazard Brothers in 1901, end quote. William Guy Carr, in Pawns in the Game, states that, quote, in 1899, J.P. Morgan and Drexel went to England to attend the International Bankers Convention. When they returned, J.P. Morgan had been appointed head representative of the Rothschild interests in the United States. As the result of the London Conference, J.P. Morgan and Company of New York, Drexel and Company of Philadelphia, Greenfell and Company of London, and Morgan Harjes Cie, Harjes space CIE of Paris, M.N. Warburg Company of Germany and America, and the House of Rothschild were all affiliated. End quote. Where's this end quote from? Oh, from Guy William Carr's book, Pawns in the Game. Already, man, my brain like fish today or something. End quote. Apparently unaware of the Peabody connection with the Rothschilds and the fact that the Morgans had always been affiliated with the House of Rothschild, Carr supposed that he had uncovered this relationship as of 1899, when in fact it went back to 1835. And here is a really long footnote. Um, Footnote: July 30th, 1930, McFadden basis of control of economic conditions, is the citation, I suppose. This control of the world business structure and of human happiness and progress by a small group is a matter of the most intense public interest. In not analyzing it, we must begin with the internal group, which centers itself around J.P. Morgan Company. Never before had there been such a powerful centralized control over finance, industrial production, credit, and wages as is at this time vested in the Morgan Group. The Morgan control of the Federal Reserve System is exercised through control of the management of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. George F. Peabody, History of the Great American Fortunes. Peabody wrote a book. Gustavus Mayers, Mod, uh, is abbreviation for something. It says Mod Lib, something Library 537 notes that Morgan's father, Junius S. Morgan, had become a partner of George Peabody in the banking business. Quote, when the Civil War came on, George Peabody and Company were appointed the financial representatives in New York in the U.S. government. With this appointment, their wealth suddenly began to pile up, where hitherto they had amassed riches by stages not remarkably rapid. They now added many millions within a very few years. End quote. According to writers of the day, the methods of George Peabody and Company were not only unreasonable, but double treason, in that, while in the act of giving inside aid to the enemy, George Peabody and Company were the potentiaries of the U.S. government and were being well paid to advance its interests. Quote, Springfield Republic, end quote, I guess is a newspaper maybe, 1866, quote, for all who know anything on the subject know very well that Peabody and his partners gave us no faith and no help in our struggle for national existence. They participated to the fullest in the common English distrust of our cause and our success, and talked and acted for the South rather than for our nation. No individuals contributed so much to flooding our money markets and weakening financial confidence in our nationality than George Peabody and Company, and none made more money by the operation. All the money that Mr. Peabody is giving away so lavishly among our institutions of learning was gained by the speculations of his house in our misfortunes, end quote. Also, New York Times, October 31st, 1866, Reconstruction Carpetbaggers Money Fund. Lightning over the Treasury Building, John Elson, Elson, I guess is the name of the book, is Lightning over the Treasury Building. John Elson, Meador, Meador, Publishing Company, Boston 41, page 53. Quote, the Bank of England, with its subsidiary banks in America under the domination of J.P. Morgan, the Bank of France, and the Reich Bank of Germany, composed an interlocking and cooperative banking system, the main objective of which was the exploitation of the people. End quote. And that's the end of the long footnote. After World War I, the Round Table became known as the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States and the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. The leading government officials of both England and the United States were chosen from its members. Let me read that again. The leading government officials of both England and the United States were chosen from its members. In the 1960s, as growing attention centered on the surreptitious government activities of the Council on Foreign Relations, subsidiary groups known as the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderbergers, representing the identical financial interests, began operations with the most important officials, such as Robert Roosa, Roosa, or Rosa, being members of all three groups. According to William Guy Carr in Pawns in the Game, the initial meeting of these ex officio planners took place in Mayor Amschel Bauer's goldsmith shop in Frankfurt in 1773. Mayor Amschel Bauer, that name sounds somewhat familiar. It's not clicking though. Bauer, who adopted the name of Rothschild, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, right, or Red Shield. That's where I get confused. Is it Rothschild, as most people pronounce it, or is it really Rothschild? I would imagine it's. I mean, it kind of sounds better as Rothschild to me, in my opinion. But whatever. Or Red Shield, from the red shield which he hung over his door to advertise his business. The red shield today is the official coat of arms of the city of Frankfurt. See cover. I guess of which book? Not this book. It's a eagle slash phoenix on the cover of Mullins's book. Anyway, quote, was only 30 years of age. Mayor Amschel Bauer slash Rothschild was only 30 years of age when he invited 12 other wealthy and influential men to meet him in Frankfurt. He proposed his and my headset turned off again. Brother. Anyways, his purpose was to convince them that if they agreed to pool their resources, they could then finance and control the world revolutionary movement and use it as their manual of action to win ultimate control of the wealth, natural resources, and manpower of the entire world. This agreement reached Mayor unfolded his revolutionary plan. The project would be backed by all the power that could be purchased with their pooled resources. By clever manipulation of their combined wealth, it would be possible to create such adverse economic conditions that the masses would be reduced to a state bordering on starvation by unemployment. Their paid propagandists would arouse feelings of hatred and revenge against the ruling classes by exposing all real and alleged cases of extravagance, licentious conduct, injustice, oppression, and persecution. They would also invent infamies to bring into disrepute others who might, if left alone, interfere with their overall plans. Well, I mean, when you gotta crush all opposition, right? Rothschild turned to a manuscript and proceeded to read a carefully prepared plan of action. 1. He argued that law, capital A, capital LAW, law was force, capital FORCE, capitalized, only in disguise. Argued law was force only in disguise. He reasoned it was logical to conclude, quote, by the laws of nature, right lies in force. Right, the moral right, basically saying might makes right, it looks like. By the laws of nature, right lies in force, quote unquote. 2. Political freedom is an idea, not a fact. In order to usurp political power, all that was necessary was to preach, quote, liberalism, end quote, so that the electorate, for the sake of an idea, would yield some of their power and prerogatives, which the plotters could then gather into their own hands. 3. The speaker asserted that the power of gold had usurped the power of liberal rulers. He pointed out that it was immaterial to the success of his plan whether the established governments were destroyed by external or internal foes, because the victor had to, of necessity, ask the aid of capital, quote unquote, capital C too, which, quote, is entirely in our hands, end quote. 4. He argued that the use of any and all means to reach their final goal was justified on the grounds that the ruler who governed by the moral code was not a skilled politician, because he left himself vulnerable and in an unstable position. 5. He asserted that, quote, our right lies in force. The word right, capital letters, is an abstract thought and proves nothing. I find a new right, all caps, to attack by the right, capital R, of the strong, capital S, to reconstruct all existing institutions and to become the sovereign lord of all those who left to us the rights, capital R, to their powers by laying them down to us in their liberalism. 6. The power of our resources must remain invisible until the very moment when it has gained such strength that no cunning or force could undermine it. He went on to outline 25 points. I don't. Looks like he doesn't cover all 25. Number 8 dealt with the use of alcoholic liquors, drugs, moral corruption, and all vice to systematically corrupt youth of all nations. Same old dirty tactics, nothing's changed. 9, they had the right to seize property by any means and without hesitation, if by doing so they secured submission and sovereignty. 10. We were the first to put the slogans liberty, equality, and fraternity into the mouths of the masses, which set up a new aristocracy. The qualification for this aristocracy is wealth, all caps, which is dependent on us. 11. Wars should be directed so that the nations engaged on both sides should be further in our debt. I mean, you can't get any more obvious than this. This is basically saying the quiet part out loud at this point, right? Let's read number 11 again. Wars should be directed so that the nations engaged on both sides are in our debt. Pause. Had another phone call. Where was I? All right, number 11. Wars should be directed so that the nations engaged on both sides should be further in our debt. Number 12. Candidates for public office should be servile and obedient to our commands so that they may readily be used. Yep, check, check off the boxes. So far, we're batting 1,000 here. 13. Propaganda. Their combined wealth would control all outlets of public information. So there's the media for you and newspapers and everything. Number 14. Panics and financial depressions would ultimately result in world government. A new order of one world government. This is end quote. This is this is not new. Plenty of people have outlined this before, but I mean this is in writing pretty much uh from the family of the Rothschilds themselves, allegedly. So Mayor Amschel Bauer turned Rothschild in 1773 laid out this plan. This is in William Guy Carr's book, The Pawns in the Game. It looks like. I'm making sure this is the right citation because this is all a quote. Yeah. William Guy Carr, Pawns in the Game. Anyways, the Rothschild family has played a crucial role in international finance for 2 centuries, as Frederick Morton and the Rothschilds, or Rothschilds, his book writes, I'm assuming it's a book, Fawcett Publishing Company, New York, 1961, is the citation for this book, publication, whatever. Quote, for the last 150 years, the history of the House of Rothschild has been to an amazing extent the backstage history of Western Europe, end quote. Parentheses, preface, end parentheses, because of their success in making loans not to individuals but to nations, they reaped huge profits. Although, as Morton writes, page 36, quote, someone once said that the wealth of Rothschild consists of the bankruptcy of nations, end quote. E.C. Nuth, K-N-U-T-H, writes, in the Empire of the City, quote, the fact that the House of Rothschild made its money in the great crashes of history and the great wars of history, the very periods when others lost their money, is beyond question, end quote. That's a good quote, I'd say. That's Empire of the City, page 71. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia states, quote, the clearest example of the personal link-up international directorates on a Western European scale is the Rothschild family. The London and Paris branches of the Rothschilds are bound not just by family ties, but also by personal link-ups in jointly controlled companies, end quote. Third edition, 1973, volume 14, page 691 is for the citation. The encyclopedia further described these companies as international monopolies. Well, that's not surprising if that's the case, which pretty much looks like they are. The sire of the family, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, established a small business as a coin dealer in Frankfurt in 1741. Although previously known as Bauer, footnote, quote, the original name of Rothschild was Bauer, end quote, page 397, Henry Clues, 28 years in Wall Street. And a footnote, he advertised his profession by putting up a sign depicting an eagle on a red shield, or perhaps it signifies a phoenix, an adaptation of the coat of arms of the city of Frankfurt, to which he added 5 golden arrows extending from the talons, signifying his 5 sons. I mean, that looks like what's on the cover of Mullins's book. It's an eagle with 5 arrows in its talons, 3 in one and 2 in the other. Anyways, because of this sign, he took the name Rothschild or Red Shield, quote unquote. When the Elector of Hesse at Hesse earned a fortune by renting Hessian mercenaries to the British to put down the rebellion in the American colonies, Rothschild was entrusted with this money to invest. He made an excellent profit both for himself and for the Elector, and attracted other accounts. In 1785, he moved to a larger house, 148 Judengasse, 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 I think E is pronounced as an A, kind of in German, a 5-story house known as, quote, the Green Shield, end quote, which he shared with the Schiff family. So this runs deep. The 5 sons established branches in the principal cities of Europe, the most successful being James in Paris and Nathan Mayer in London. Ignatius Bala in The Romance of the Rothschilds tells us how the London Rothschild established his fortune. He went to Waterloo, where the fate of Europe hung in the balance, saw that Napoleon was losing the battle, and rushed back to Brussels. At Ostend, he tried to hire a boat to England, but because of a raging storm, no one was willing to go out. Rothschild offered 500 francs, then 700, and finally 1,000 francs for a boat. One sailor said, quote, I will take you for 2,000 francs. Then at least my widow would have something if we are drowned, end quote. That must have been a hell of a storm. Despite the storm, they crossed the channel. The next morning, Rothschild was at his usual post in the London Exchange. Everyone noticed how pale and exhausted he looked. Suddenly, he started selling, dumping large quantities of securities. Panic immediately swept the exchange. Rothschild is selling. He knows we have lost the Battle of Waterloo. Rothschild and all of his known agents continued to throw securities onto the market. Bala says, quote, nothing could arrest the disaster. At the same time, he was quietly buying up all securities by means of secret agents whom no one knew. In a single day, he had gained nearly £1,000,000 sterling, giving rise to the saying, quote, the Allies won the Battle of Waterloo, but it was really Rothschild who won, end quote. And there's a footnote. The New York Times, April 1st, 1915, reported that in 1914, Baron Nathan Mayer de Rothschild went to court to suppress Ignatius Bala's book on the grounds that the Waterloo story about his grandfather was untrue and libelous. Of course, he would say that. The court ruled that the story was true, dismissed Rothschild's suit, and ordered him to pay all costs. Wow. That is something. Maybe they actually had a backbone back then. The New York Times noted in this story that, quote, the total Rothschild wealth had been estimated at 2 billion, end quote. A previous story in the New York Times, May 27th, 1905, noted that Baron Alphonse de Rothschild, head of the French House of Rothschild, possessed 60 million in American securities in his fortune, although the Rothschilds reputedly were not active in the American field. This explains why their agent JP Morgan had only 19 million in securities in his estate when he died in 1913, and owed 7 billion of that to the dealer Duveen. Art dealer Duveen? I'm not sure who that is. Duveen. The tremendous amounts of American securities handled by Morgan were actually owned by his employer, Rothschild. End quote. End of footnote. In The Profits of War, Richard Lewinson, Lewinson, Richard Lewinson says, quote, Rothschild's war profits from the Napoleonic Wars financed their later stock speculations under Metternich, Austria, after long hesitation, finally agreed to accept financial direction from the House of Rothschild, end quote. After the success of his Waterloo exploit and its Helvet exploit, Nathan Mayer Rothschild gained control of the Bank of England through his near monopoly of consols, quote unquote, CONSOLS, and other shares. Several central quote unquote banks, or banks which had the power to issue currency, had been started in Europe. The Bank of Sweden in 1656, which began to issue notes in 1661, the earliest being the Bank of Amsterdam, which had started in 1609, and the Bank of Hamburg in 1619. The establishment of the Bank of England had been made possible by the Bank of Amsterdam, which financed Oliver Cromwell's seizure of power in England. Yeah, fuck that guy. Now maybe I have a reason to use this. Well, I have a lot of reasons to give the finger to all these motherfuckers. Yeah, fuck Cromwell. Anyways, Cromwell's seizure of power in England in 1649, ostensibly because of religious differences. Yeah, right. Cromwell died in 1657, and the throne of England was re-established when Charles II was crowned in 1660. He died in 1685. In 1689, the same group of bankers regained power in England by putting King William of Orange on the throne. He soon repaid his backers by ordering the British Treasury to borrow £1,250,000 from these bankers. He also issued them a royal charter for the Bank of England, which permitted them to consolidate the national debt, which had just been created by this loan, and to secure payments of interest and principal by direct taxation of the people. Financial enslavement. The charter forbade private goldsmiths to store gold and to issue receipts, which gave the stockholders of the Bank of England a money monopoly. The goldsmiths also were required to store their gold in the Bank of England vaults. Lols. This is ridiculous. The goldsmiths also were, I already read that, not only had their privilege of issuing circulating medium been taken away by government decree, but their fortunes were now turned over to those who had supplanted them. Footnote. Note. In the United States, after the stockholders of the Federal Reserve System had consolidated their power in 1934, our government also issued orders that private citizens could not store or hold gold. End of footnote. Well, isn't that telling? In his cantos, quote unquote, 46, 27, Ezra Pound refers to the unique privileges which William Paterson advertised in his prospectus of the charter of the Bank of England. Quote, said Paterson hath benefit of interest on all the monies which it, the bank, creates out of nothing. End quote. The nothing, quote unquote, which is referred to, of course, is the bookkeeping operation of the bank, which creates, quote unquote, money by entering a notation that it has lent, quote unquote, you $1,000, money which did not exist until the bank made the entry. Yep. By 1698, the British Treasury owed £16 million to the Bank of England. By 1815, principally due to the compounding of interest, the debt had risen to £885 million. Some of this increase was due to the wars which had flourished during that period, including the Napoleonic Wars and the wars which England had fought to retain its American colony. Right, the Revolutionary War, etc. William Paterson, 1658 to 1719, himself benefited little from, quote, the monies which the bank creates out of nothing, end quote, as he withdrew after a policy disagreement from the Bank of England a year after it was founded. A later William Paterson became one of the framers of the United States Constitution. While the name lingers on, like the pernicious central bank itself, Patterson had found himself unable to work with the Bank of England, right? Because Patterson died in 1719, which is way before 1776, etc. A different Patterson, of course, a later Patterson. So I don't know why I thought that looked funny. Never mind. Patterson had found himself unable to work with the Bank of England's stockholders. Many of them remained anonymous, but an early description of the Bank of England stated it was, quote, a society of about 1,313 persons, including the King and Queen of England, who had £10,000 of stock, the Duke of Leeds, Duke of Devonshire, Earl of Pembroke, and the Earl of Bradford. End quote. Because of his success in his speculations, Baron Nathaniel Mayer de Rothschild, as he now called himself, reigned as the supreme financial power in London. He arrogantly claimed during a party in his mansion, this is the famous quote, allegedly, quote, I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man that controls Britain's money supply controls the British government, British Empire, and I control the British money supply. End quote. Yeah, I would see him saying that. His brother James in Paris had also achieved dominance in French finance. In Baron Edmund de Rothschild, David Druck, D-R-U-C-K, writes, quote, James Rothschild's wealth had reached the 600 million mark. Only one man in France possessed more. That was the king, whose wealth was 800 million. The aggregate wealth of all the bankers in France was 150 million less than James Rothschild. This naturally gave him untold powers, even to the extent of unseating governments whenever he chose to do so. It is well known, for example, that he overthrew the cabinet of Prime Minister Thiers, Thers, I don't know how you pronounce it. Fear, maybe? I don't know, it's French, I guess. End quote. The expansion of Germany under Bismarck was accompanied by his dependence on Samuel Bleichroder, Bleichroder, court bankers of the Prussian Empire, who had been known as an agent of the Rothschilds since 1828. The later Chancellor of Germany, Dr. von Bethmann Hollweg, Hollweg, was the son of Moritz Bethmann of Frankfurt, who had intermarried with the Rothschilds. Emperor Wilhelm I also relied heavily on Bischofsheim Goldschmidt and Sir Ernest Cassel of Frankfurt. Bischofsheim, Bischofsheim, Goldschmidt and Ernst Cassel, Cassel, who emigrated to England and became personal banker to the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. Castle's daughter married Lord Mountbatten, giving the family a direct relationship to the present British Crown. Sad trombone. We're not going to talk anything about that. Still got a few pages to go, but I got to pause here for the time being. At the top of the page, all right, I'm going to pause. Anyways, Josephson states that Philip Mountbatten was related through the Cassels to the Mayor Rothschilds of Frankfurt. Thus, the English royal house of Windsor has a direct family relationship to the Rothschilds. In 1901, when Queen Victoria's son Edward became King Edward VII, he re-established the Rothschild ties. Paul Emden, in Behind the Throne, says, quote, Edward's preparation for his métier, M-E-T-I-E-R, was quite different from that of his mother. Hence he ruled, quote unquote, less than she did. Gratefully, he retained around him men who had been with him in the age of the building of the Baghdad Railway. There were added to the advisory staff Leopold and Alfred de Rothschild, various members of the Sassoon family, and above all, his private financial advisor, Sir Ernest Cassel, or Castle. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. End quote. There's another quote here somewhere. The whole thing. I think this whole next paragraph is still part of the quote from that book, Behind the Throne. So I'm going to say, quote, the enormous fortune which Cassel made in a relatively short time gave him an immense power which he never misused. He amalgamated the firm of Vickers Sons with the Naval Construction Company and the Maxim-Nordenfeld, the Nordenfeldt, Maxim-Nordenfeld Guns and Ammunition Company, pause. This is the name of a company. A fusion from which there arose the worldwide firm of Vickers, Sons and Maxim. On an entirely different capacity from Castle, were businessmen like the Rothschilds. The firm was run on democratic principles, and the various partners all had to be members of the family. With great hospitality and in a princely manner, they led the lives of grand seigneurs, 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 I think that's how you pronounce that. It was natural that Edward VII should find them congenial, thanks to their international family relationships and still more extended business connections. They knew the whole world, were well informed about everybody, and had reliable knowledge on matters which did not appear on the surface. This combination of finance and politics had been a trademark of the Rothschilds from the very beginning. The House of Rothschild always knew more than could be found in the papers, and even more than could be read in the reports which arrived at the Foreign Office. In other countries, also, the relationships of the Rothschilds extended behind the throne. There's the name of the book there. Not until numerous diplomatic publications appeared in the years after the war did a wider public learn how strongly Alfred de Rothschild Shield's hand affected the politics of Central Europe during the 20 years before World War One, before the war, parentheses World War One, in parentheses, end quote. With the control of the money came the control of the news media, goes hand in hand. Kent Cooper, head of the Associated Press, writes in his autobiography, Barriers Down, quote, international bankers under the House of Rothschild acquired an interest in the three lending European agencies, end quote. Thus, the Rothschilds bought control of Reuters International News Agency, based in London, Havas in France, and Wolf in Germany, which controlled the dissemination of all news in Europe. In Inside Europe, John Gunther, Gunther, wrote in 1936 that any French prime minister at the end of 1935 was a creature of the financial oligarchy, and that this financial oligarchy was dominated by 12 regents, of whom 6 were bankers and were headed by Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Excuse me. The iron grip of the London connection, quote unquote, on the media was exposed in a recent book by Ben J. I could butcher this one. Bagdikian, Bagdikian. The Media Monopoly is the name of the book. Probably want to get this. I kind of want to get a lot of books, really. Satrabone. Described as, quote, described the London connection, I guess, as, quote, a startling report on the 50 corporations that control what America sees, hears, and reads, end quote. Bagdikian, who edited the nation's most influential magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, until the monopoly suddenly closed it down, reveals the interlocking directorates among the 50 corporations which control the news, but fails to trace them back to the 5 London banking houses which control them. He mentions that CBS interlocks with the Washington Post, Allied Chemical, Wells Fargo Bank, and others, but does not tell the reader that Brown Brothers Harriman controls CBS, or that the Eugene Mayer family, Lazard Ferreras, controls Allied Chemical and the Washington Post, and Kuhn Loeb Company, the Wells Fargo Bank. There's no comma there. Company, comma, the Wells Fargo Bank. I don't know. That seems like there's a typo in there somewhere. Anyway, he shows the New York Times interlocked with Morgan Guarantee Trust, American Express, First Boston Corporation, and others, but does show the banking interlocks. He does not mention the Federal Reserve System in his entire book, which is conspicuous by its absence. Pause. Take a drink of Gatorade. Badikayan documents that the media monopoly is steadily closing down more newspapers and magazines. Washington, D.C., with one newspaper, The Post, is unique among world capitals. London has 11 daily newspapers, Paris 14, Rome 18, Tokyo 17, and Moscow 9. He cites a study from the 1982 World Press Encyclopedia that the United States is at the bottom of industrial nations in the number of daily newspapers sold per 1,000 population. Sweden leads the list with 572. The United States is at the bottom with 287. There is universal distrust of the media by Americans because of their notorious monopoly and bias. The media unanimously urge higher taxes on working people, more government spending, a welfare state with totalitarian powers, closer relations with Russia, and a rabid denunciation of anyone who opposes communism. This is the program of, quote, the London Connection, end quote. It flaunts a maniacal racism and has its motto the dictum of its high priestess, Susan Sontag, that, quote, the white race is the cancer of history. Pause. This is the words of Susan Sontag, allegedly, uh, quote unquote. Everyone should be against cancer. The media monopoly deals with its opponents in one of two ways: either frontal assault of libel, which the average person cannot afford to litigate, or an iron curtain of silence, the standard treatment for any work which exposes its clandestine activities. Yep. If you don't want anybody to know who you are, the media will keep the frick silent about you. If the media is talking about you, then shit, you can know for sure that whoever that person is probably compromised or a puppet or an actor or something. I mean the mainstream media. I don't mean necessarily all media, but I think the alternative media can probably pretty much be in that too at this point. The alternative quote unquote media is not that much better. Anyways, although the Rothschild plan does not match any single political or economic movement since it was enunciated in 1773, vital parts of it can be discerned in all political evolution since that date. LaRouche, or La Roche, LAR, capital R, OUCHE, points out that the round tables, plural, sponsored Fabian socialism in England. Hmm. Antonin Tavistock, perhaps, while backing the NAZI regime through a roundtable member in Germany, Dr. Hjalmar Schacht. I still don't know that. HJALMAR space capital SCHACHT, and that they used the NAZI government during World War II, throughout World War II, through Roundtable member Admiral Canaris, CANARIS, while Alan Dulles ran a collaborating intelligence operation in Switzerland from the Allies. Yeah, we know all about that, don't we? And that is the end of chapter 6. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that's some important background information even today. Well, things get shuffled around and this, that, and the other. There's still the same kind of players on the game board, as it were. So that's it for this one.